My name is Stapleton Roy. I'm the Director Emeritus of the Kissinger Institute, meaning I don't have to do any of the administrative work and can focus on the big issues of the day. Our panel is going to look at China and the Western Hemisphere. Our session is titled Chinese Policy in the Americas, but that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about China and the Western Hemisphere. And we have three terrific panelists who will look at various aspects of this question. But it's really a fascinating topic because you can learn a lot about international relations from watching what happens when one major power becomes involved in the periphery of another major power. For example, in Europe, the consequences of pushing the US-backed NATO up to the borders of Russia were miscalculated, even though totally accurately predicted 10 years earlier by people like George Kennan. But it generated a major crisis, and now we have a problem in Europe that nobody had anticipated a few years ago. We have a US-North Korean summit, the second one, that may take place in the near future, right on the periphery of China. And curiously, China is very sensitive about US activities in its own periphery. Well, one of the issues we'll be looking at is how does the United States respond when China begins treading in our periphery? Do we handle it like a mature major country, or do we see Chinese engaged in all sorts of nefarious activities? I won't tell you the answer to that question. I'll let our panelists dance around on the issue. But we can learn something about ourselves and we can learn something about China by paying attention to how China moves into an unfamiliar area where it has very important economic interests, but does not have a historical pattern of having special relationships in this half of the world. So, without further ado, we have Laura is going to begin. She is a Canadian specialist. Benjamin, I'm not giving you their bios because I think they're available in the program, is going to talk more broadly about the southern part of the Western Hemisphere. And Jennifer has been carrying out environment and energy programs for nearly 2 decades here at the Kissinger Associates and is very familiar with Chinese activities in this area. So Laura, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Stapleton. Yes, I'm the director of the Canada Institute here at the Wilson Center, and most of my time is spent being preoccupied with Canada-U.S. relations. Things are very, very, very interesting. But in the 4 or 5 seconds a day that are not preoccupied with the latest presidential tweet, I continue to have an interest in Canada-China relations because we're at a very interesting time in the way that the Canada-China relationship is evolved. So I'm not going to talk much about China's policy towards Canada, which is romance. We love you. You got resources. It's a wonderful country. It's clean and green. Just don't try to tell us what to do with our domestic policy. I think that pretty much captures it. From the Canadian side, however, it's a bit more challenging. It's kind of a romance and repel strategy. It is really ambivalent under the Trudeau government at this point. Some of you may remember that the Harper government had a really hard time with China. It was engage, oh, not so much, oh, engage, oh, we're nervous about you buying our energy resources, engage, we don't know what to do, maybe you should clean up your human rights. So it was so the Harper government left office kind of paralyzed on Canada-China relations, but Justin Trudeau, he was going to do better. Why? Because his father was the first foreign leader to recognize People's Republic of China, because both father and son had camped and hiked actively in China, and by gosh, he was gonna make this better. Now he's found exactly the same set of issues, set of problems, and maybe even torqued up a little more, because it was always the morality issue in Canada, the human rights issue. We want to wait until there's a better China, and then we'll engage with a better China. And as you know, the Justin Trudeau government is really tied into diversity, human rights, gender, environment, etc. And so it wants to engage with China, but by gosh, we wish it were a better China, at least as far as Canada is concerned. But at the same time, the romance is still there. Chinese investment in Canada is very significant. China is the second largest export market for Canadian agriculture. Think pork, think soy, think canola. Also parts of Canada, the central part of Canada, that don't get a lot of export or trade exposure. But for them, China is extremely important to them. In addition, China is just a very big part of Canada's social fabric. Chinese, both Mandarin and Cantonese combined, is the third most spoken language in Canada. 12% of Toronto, 30% of Vancouver claim Chinese ethnic origin. So in Vancouver, almost 3 in 10. Meanwhile, 57% of Canadians have an unfavorable view of China as a result of housing price escalation, particularly in British Columbia, concerns about industrial espionage, involvement in organized crime. I mean, if you really want to read a fascinating whodunit, go to one of the Canadian newspapers and look at the money laundering scheme that exists between Canadian casinos, real estate, drugs, and not just suitcases full of cash, but boxcar. I don't have boxcars anymore, but container loads of cash. It is really extraordinary. Oh, and of course, opioids is involved in that. So there really are some serious concerns in Canada, but at the same time, if you're a sleepy little town in Nova Scotia or Manitoba and you want to torque your economic development, you've got to find some of that Chinese investment. So Canada, romance, repel, we don't know. They were going to do a free trade agreement with China, similar to what Australia has negotiated. It has kind of fallen by the wayside, both because they really weren't sure how to operationalize it, but also because, frankly, of events in the United States and the NAFTA. There are only so many negotiating resources to go around, and Canada has left its Asia focus on trade, or China focus on trade, for a while. And again, concerns that Canada just doesn't have the market power to force concessions from China. China is 40 times larger by population than Canada. The U.S., by contrast, China is only 4 times larger than the U.S. So what do we need? We need Canada-U.S. alliance on the sorts of issues that Canada and the U.S. are concerned about. There is no airspace between Canadian and U.S. concerns on trade issues in Canada. We share exactly the same viewpoint on overcapacity on steel, industrial espionage, data localization, technology transfer requirements, tariff escalation, inconsistent application of rules, slow processing of shipments, limits on FDI and repatriation of profits. And why this is such a great sort of marriage made in heaven is Canadians don't have the market power to force concessions, but they love details and they love beavering away on proposals, and they love, ensuring that every I is dotted and T is crossed. So you bring U.S. market power and Canadian secretarial ability, and you've got a very powerful weapon. But instead of focusing on how to manage the China relationship more effectively, the current U.S. policy seems to be about alienating the allies. And so if and when that shifts for a different direction, I am hopeful that we can bring those conversations back together. And just as a final point, is that one of the great instruments that we do have for managing the relationship is the WTO, harkening back to one of the questions on the former panel. Better to have a rules-based system than not to have a rules-based system, even if it doesn't work particularly well. So attempts to get rid of the WTO, remove U.S. from the WTO, I think would be very, very detrimental, not just for the global trading system, but also for that particular relationship with China.
Thank you, Laura. Benjamin, does the non-English speaking part of the Western Hemisphere share Canada's views across the board?
Well, thank you very much. Also, I would like to point out that I only just began at the Wilson Center. I'm very happy to be here, and thankful to Robert for hauling me off right off the entrance door onto this panel to speak of Latin America. That includes some English-speaking countries, of course, at least from the Chinese point of view, looking at it all. It's a really important conversation to have, clearly, and I think it's important because Washington is misreading, in my view, much of what China's presence in Latin America implies. But by the same token, China is often misreading its own strength there, and somewhat smugly flattering itself to perceive itself as being very successful there. And Latin Americans are probably the worse off for all that. And when we speak of Latin America, I'm taking the bracket that the Chinese Foreign Ministry uses, which is Latin America and the Caribbean. That includes the Portuguese speakers, the Spanish speakers, the English speakers, not to mention Guarani and Quechua and Nahuatl and all the others. And there is, for instance, in the also in the parallel organization inside the Communist Party Central Committee, Bureau Number 5, that also is in charge directly of Chinese foreign policy. So it's formulated very cautiously and very carefully, and a lot of experience is gathered over time. But I'll just start with a few sort of broad figures to dimension it a little bit, because I think also that is sometimes misrepresented a little. Trade, for starters, just to put the big one out there, is around $250 billion in volume, but that is in fact the same as it was 5 years ago. So bilateral trade between the whole region and China is around that figure, pretty constant, and that is only about the same as the European Union does with Latin America, and far less than the United States. So although China has grown enormously as an important partner in the past few years, 15 years roughly, it's still not necessarily displacing the United States. The same goes for investment. China has, of course, been investing more and more and more, but if you look at it cumulatively, which I think is very valuable, what are the capital interests of any one country in Latin America? China doesn't even make the top 10 in Peru or in Brazil or in almost any other country, because many nations have been at it for a couple of hundred years and keep pumping more in and being very present there. And in terms of loans, the opposite is true, I would say, because we have publications, you may see that loans by Chinese development banks exceed the loans of multilateral banks in Washington. But that a lot of that gets paid back. So nobody voluntarily walks into a debt trap, and nor does Beijing go around placing them out there. So yes, China has come from close to zero to a very major presence, but it's still a question how important that is in relation to others, and how can it be balanced. So what is China's policy towards Latin America? They've made it very clear. We can look it up. There was a policy paper in 2008, published just after Obama got elected, and another one just after the Trump election, 2016. A policy paper is out there that lays out very carefully what the priorities are, and they step forward quite carefully with those priorities. The policy is driven by domestic needs, so that's food security and energy security and supplies for industry. So that maps out perfectly with what the investment, for instance, last year in Brazil was. Chinese investment in Brazil, just under $20 billion, and that matched primarily was in the energy sector and in agriculture. So you can see they follow that plan quite diligently, and what that implies, though, is to get access to more iron ore and to more soybeans, you need more railroads and ports, And that's where the Belt and Road Initiative comes in. So the Chinese were very successful after 2000 with the Great Western opening up, connecting their western regions with the coast. And so they perceive that this is the way forward. And if you look at a map of Latin America, railroad or road map, you will see that there are huge gaps. There's very little physical connectivity. So that's something where China proposes to intervene. And in fact, they have only recently sent out or invited every single country in the region to sign an MOU to join the Belt and Road Initiative. And so far 7 countries have signed, to my knowledge, maybe another one in the last couple of days. Many of them are thinking about it, but there's little reason not to sign an MOU. But it is a significant sort of advance that China is making in that respect. And China's also learning very well. So that's something also that, for example, the Inter-American Dialogue and the SECLA group of scholars in China recently published a list of the 60 centers for Latin American studies that have opened up in China in the last couple of years. And that is something that is clearly China is aware that it has shortcomings, that it needs to learn better to engage. Also with minority peoples, it has difficulties working with them in its own country, and confronts surprise difficulties in Latin America when it engages there with civil society groups and so on. So this is not so easy to sell when to square with what they sell as a mutually beneficial, collaborative, mutually supportive partnership. So that's where there's a slight disconnect, maybe we can see between what China puts forward and wraps around this developing foreign policy towards Latin America, and some of the difficulties it's encountering. I think we can maybe go into some more details in the Q&A.
Thank you. Jennifer?
Okay. Hey there. I've been, as State mentioned, I've been here at the Wilson Center for almost 20 years, and so I've had a front row seat on China's energy and environmental trends. And a lot of it, I think I'm going to start with the US first and then go to Latin America. I mean, I've had the front row seat on US-China energy and environmental relations. In fact, my first publication was called Crouching Suspicions, Hidden Potential. And that's kind of like, so God, I've been here long enough, I can talk in phases. First phase, Crouching Suspicions, Hidden Potential, starting particularly with Al Gore, seeing that US and China could use energy and environmental cooperation as a way to build not only cooperation that benefits both the country in terms of energy and environment, but also to have a channel for goodwill. Because a lot of the conversations here today are talking about how the US and China, that we're not always the best of friends, even though there is romance and pushing away and things like that. But then next kind of phase that really did emerge with the Obama administration helped in part, should note, that the US foundations, NGOs, universities, and think tanks have been engaging with Chinese NGO government researchers and a lot of counterparts on energy, environmental policies, programs, and cooperation, so that you have both the government bilateral and also the non-governmental. But so when Obama came on board, where things had started to cool off under Bush, we had this quick opening on 9 clean energy agreements, and it was like multiple ping pong matches. I could hardly keep track of all the US-Chinese cooperation on electric vehicles, clean building energy efficiency, and it was really exciting. And all of that kind of built up to the US-China climate agreement, which helped fuel the energy globally for the Paris Agreement. And so in terms of partnerships, right, that this was a really kind of exciting time. But that time period also is what I would call kind of cooperative competitors, right? The US and China were working together in many, clean energy cooperation, building markets together potentially. But then there were problems with, from our side, and I fancy too in Canada, about dumping solar panels. Mm-hmm. That was a big concern. But as a side note, many people I brought here to speak at the Wilson Center would say, well, most of the jobs are created where solar panels are installed, so fine to buy these cheap ones. Now, and we also saw, in this kind of cooperative competitors time, a lot of Chinese clean energy investment in the United States. But then there were also some problems. I mean, was some kind of a wind turbine factory wanted to be built next to some kind of military base in Washington. So bad scoping from the Chinese side. And now, I don't know, I haven't got a clever name for today's US-China environmental relationship. We'll just say that now the environment and energy cooperation that we had before is just, it appears to be off the table for discussion. And, you know, a lot of people in my network who have been working this way feel high disappointment because it was a very kind of flourishing era of cooperation. Okay, I'll set that aside because I was told I'm covering many things. And, you know, Western Hemisphere environmental kind of impact or relationship with China. But again, using the Chinese metaphor, qing ting dian shui, it's going to be a dragonfly skimming the water. And Stape and you guys will tell me where to dive deeper in the Q&A. So for Latin America, I mean, you already mentioned how the trade relationship, you know, more or less the same, but the types of Chinese investment that's going in, like 60% back in the early 2000s was extractive industries and hardly any clean energy. And now we're starting to see about 10% clean energy investments. I mean, it's not huge, but, you know, you get Goldwind putting in wind turbines in Panama and Chile, solar parks in Mexico. I mean, I think the Chinese, you have to think too that when Chinese, for these kind of energy or extractive industry investments, it's not being directed by Beijing per se. Sometimes, you know, the banks are giving loans and they're just scattering forth. Would you say that's kind of a correct assessment from what you've seen? But mining is, of course, has been a big industry of contention in many countries in Latin America. I mean, Peru, I mean, they've got a lot of copper. China's the largest copper, you know, second after Chile. And so, again, another kind of romance blossoms here. And, you know, you see, what's interesting is that the very first Chinese company that went into Peru, the Shogun Corporation, one of their copper mines that was located, I have to read this, the Minería Chilconas Tomorocho? I'll let him say it. I was trying to give it a Chinese pronunciation. Pomorocho. That you know, they start that back in 2008 they started negotiations with the local communities because for their mining operations to expand. See, I love this with Chinese. We need to move your entire town. Yes, and so you know, in China there would be no negotiations. Boom, it would be gone. Well, they actually negotiated, and I mean, clearly there were some bumps, but overall, a lot of the assessment has been that it was fairly successful. But then we've recently was one of a Chinese lawyer in town, Zhang Jingjing, pointed out to me a case that she'd been working on down in Ecuador, that there was a Chinese mine that it wasn't as much an issue of, you know, instead of negotiating, they were just trying to move the people out. And so there was a court case, and she actually, a Chinese lawyer, went in and gave an amicus and talked about how, well, you know, Chinese has signed these international, you know, UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and it ends up that the local court actually stopped all the mining. And so there's a lot going on in the mining sector, and you're starting to see, you know, some kind of community standing up where they're seeing the Chinese doing wrong. 2 more quick things, 3 maybe. Fishing. Chinese economy is growing rapidly, and the Chinese hunger for both pork and fish. I'm going to talk about both those briefly because they relate to Latin America. In terms of fish, I mean, China's the #1 producer and consumer and exporter of fish. And a lot of they've got like 18% of all the global market in fishing overseas. And a lot of a fair number of their distant fishing fleet, they don't always comply with international law. I mean, they sometimes, like in Latin America, they will sign agreements to get inside that 200-mile range to fish, but a lot of the countries maybe don't have the capability of monitoring their fishing. So China's one of the leading, their fishing fleet, leading culprits of illegal fishing. And you know, there was a case just a few months back where this one boat was caught near the Galapagos Marine Reserve, and they had 300 tons of fish on board, lots of sharks, endangered species. And strikingly, that the Ministry of Agriculture that oversees the distant fishing fleets, they just last December passed some new rules that is going to start penalizing them. I mean, China's distant fishing fleet, one of the reasons they've been able to expand so quickly is that their fuel is subsidized. And so that's one of the biggest costs, obviously. And so now in the last, again, starting since December, we're starting to see the Chinese government trying to rein in some of this illegal fishing. And as a side note, as for a big environmental impact besides the overfishing of the actual fish, because a lot of when the Chinese or any other illegal fishing boats are often caught, they have to drop their nets and flee. And a lot of these nets and other equipment that remains behind become what we call ghost nets, and is evidently one of the leading killers of marine life. Oh yeah, I'm getting all depressed now. Okay, so Chinese people are hungry also for pork. I mean, China consumes about half the world's pork. You're not surprised, are you?
No.
No, all right. Well, and you have to feed those pigs something, and that would be soybeans. I mean, Brazil, 75% of their soybeans go to China. Argentina, 90%. And but they import most of their soybeans from the U.S. And it's kind of interesting with the trade issue is that if they're not buying U.S. soybeans, I mean, Latin America can't fulfill that. There's obviously challenges when you have countries in Latin America that are expanding their farmland to feed the Chinese hunger for soybeans, so the normal deforestation, land use disputes, fertilizer runoff. There's that. The last thing I'm supposed to give kind of a wave to, because sadly our friend from New Zealand couldn't make it, in terms of China's Arctic policy. They just had a policy white paper that was issued a few months ago that really envisions now we've got the Belt and Road, now we have a specific polar Silk Road, which is a new route that wants to go through the unfrozen Arctic. Now, China, they're really positioning themselves to be not just an Arctic state, but an Arctic stakeholder. And they're really interested in creating trade routes, expanding foreign direct investment in Arctic states, and also doing scientific research. On that side, kind of a positive story is that they're very concerned about the melting ice. I mean, it does make the trade easier and a lot faster, but China is really fearful of rising ocean levels on their coastlines. One little side note, and then I'm giving them enough information to hopefully be dangerous in the Q&A. I mean, China is, in terms of the Arctic, they're partnering with the Russians. I mean, the Russians, no one wants to invest in some of their energy exploration and natural gas. The Chinese will. And just this summer, there was a shipment from the Yamal LNG project in the Russian Arctic to China, and it made it in just 19 days because it was able to go through the ice. I mean, China's building a lot of icebreakers. The Russians have more, of course. The U.S. were a little, I don't know, do you guys have icebreakers?
Yep.
How many do you have?
I don't know. Enough. We have
Enough. Yeah, so pardon the real super skim on the Arctic, but I mean, China's very focused on the Arctic and not quite sure where the U.S. is on that. I mean, a little bit behind the curve from what I'm told. All right. We've done it for you, sir.
Thank you. For those of you who are interested in the Arctic, I myself know very little about the Arctic, but I was shocked to read in the Washington Post last weekend that you can now take luxury cruises to the North Pole, so that the ice sheet in summer has retreated sufficiently so that there's open water in the area around the North Pole, which includes many ice flows, but they're much thinner now than they used to be. And the luxury cruises, so far as I know, Canada hasn't gotten into that business.
No, but when you get stuck, Canadian Search and Rescue and the Arctic Rangers are happy to come and extract you for a modest fee.
Well, let me ask you a question, and then we'll get to questions from the audience. You all have been good Marxists in implying that the economic base for the Chinese activities in the Western Hemisphere is perhaps the core. At least you emphasized how it had emerged, although apparently not growing particularly. The trade has remained relatively stable. But the press attention recently has been to the fact that El Salvador decided to break relations with the Republic of China and Taiwan and shift recognition to the government of the People's Republic of China as the sole legal government of China. This is an action that the United States took in 1979 when we established diplomatic relations with China. The White House reaction has been very negative. They issued a statement saying that this decision by the El Salvador government affects not just El Salvador, but also the economic health and security of the entire Americas region. The El Salvadoran government's receptiveness to China's apparent interference in the domestic politics of a Western Hemisphere country is of grave concern to the United States and will result in a reevaluation of our relationship with El Salvador. And the Washington has recalled 3 of our ambassadors from Central America, whose countries had recently decided to shift recognition to the People's Republic of China. They add that around the world, governments are waking up to the fact that China's economic inducements facilitate economic dependency and domination, not partnership. It would seem that this is an assertion that the United States has a national interest in decisions by the governments of the region on which government is the legitimate government of China. I wonder, how do regional countries react to this assertion of a historic right to take an interest in such matters?
Well, responding on behalf of about 3 dozen countries, it's very diverse, and there's obviously China has managed to integrate Brazil in a special way, being after all representing economically half the continent, half that subcontinent. There's a special relationship there within the BRICS framework. China has very strong discussions, very productive discussions with countries like Chile or Peru, where it has a strong economic relationships, but also manages to cooperate on a number of issues. So they see more eye to eye on Jennifer mentioned a couple of positive outcomes when often it was Chinese learning how to engage well with the local governments, even not the national, but individual stakeholders there. So you get a big diversity, and then you have this case of the 3 countries that recently switched, in the past year, switched to recognize Beijing, and that is something clearly, the Washington is very worried about, but that's where I call it misreading, because I feel that calling back recalling the heads of mission from those 3 countries. Panama doesn't even have a U.S. ambassador, head of mission there. To bring them back here for several days. That was very symbolic in diplomatic language. That was something that quite rightly President Varela of Panama reacted to strongly, saying, how can the U.S. ought to respect the sovereignty of our country, and so we have every right to do that. I think there are a number of things in there. One is that the U.S., the current administration, the Trump administration, is apprehensive that it'll be a domino effect, so there will be more countries recognizing Beijing, and this is squeezing the space for Taiwan in many spheres. So that's why there's this idea of pushing back and in some way threatening to punish switchers. But then there's also some very real concerns, you could say are quite reasonable, in that Panama, for example, as just at the CAF conference 10 days ago or so, a minister from Panama explained there had been very in-depth discussions as to how China can benefit Panama and how Panama can get the best results from a cooperative relationship. And that was not the case in El Salvador. So that's where there's quite a concern, but they've been bunched together, and that's probably not very helpful. I mean, El Salvador, it seems there was one particular party that had this good relationship with China, and that's been one that has been going on for many, many years with Beijing. And so that's something, one has to distinguish, and currently there's sort of this was an allergic reaction by Washington that isn't really very helpful. On the contrary, there ought to be leaning in towards such changes and seeing, well, how can we, like you mentioned, the case in Ecuador, how can U.S., or for that matter, Canadian entities engage with the local communities or with the Chinese companies. Canada also doesn't have a super clean reputation in terms of mining in Latin America, but they have a lot of experience, and so there are many things that could be done more in cooperation rather than antagonizing in that way.
The White House statement, Laura, said that the decision by El Salvador affects the economic health and security of the entire Americas. Since Canada is part of the Americas, I just wonder whether Canada has a viewpoint on this.
You just keep wanting to reel me in. I'm thinking, good, I skated out of that, but no, Stapleton pulls me back in. Canada has been traditionally, and under the Trudeau government, continues to be active in soft power efforts, hearts and minds types of things that keep it out of the major conflict zones. To date, Canada has really stood back and let the United States supported U.S. policies on mainland China and its brothers, and has not taken a direct position there. If U.S. policy becomes erratic or quite different from what it's been in the past, I don't know that Canada would move to take an independent policy. But at this point, I think they're happy with the soft power in the background and let the big boys fight it out.
Okay. In the United States, we would say big boys and girls.
Big boys and girls.
Yeah.
You're so inclusive.
Okay. Let's go to the audience. Yes? Please wait for the microphone and then identify yourself and your organization, if there is one.
Thank you. Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. And my question actually is for Ambassador Roy. You played a very important role in the process of establishing diplomatic relations with China in 1979. But what I would like to hear your views on the question you raised. So what's your view on the U.S. reaction to Latin American countries switch their diplomatic ties with China? Do you believe all these actions will trigger the U.S. playing Taiwan card in the next step following the trade war? If the trade war cannot win, so the U.S. will play more Taiwan cards. Thank you.
I was trying to divert such questions to my members of the panel, but very briefly. In 1979, the United States recognized the People's Republic of China as the sole legal government of China and acknowledged the Chinese position that Taiwan is part of China. That is the one China policy that President Trump has reaffirmed in a phone conversation with President Xi Jinping, would be the U.S. position. And it was subsequently confirmed by members of the Trump administration that this one China policy was based on the 3 joint communiques between the United States and China. So that is the formal American position on the question of recognition. The question of how that relates to other countries is more complicated. But being an American, of course, I believe in American exceptionalism. And American exceptionalism means that we can engage in certain behavior patterns, but that doesn't necessarily mean that other countries should follow our example. So there is no inherent contradiction in the way that the United States is reacting to that, and indeed there is perhaps some historic background for that type of a reaction. You will notice that when I posed the question, I was not interested in the rightness or wrongness of the American position, but on how the regional countries were reacting. And I think we got a sense from Benjamin that in Latin America there's some skepticism about it, and in Canada there's a reluctance to take a position on the issue.
Yes.
Of the, if that's a fair summation. So that's my answer to your question. Yes.
I'm Michael Davis. Like Ben, I'm a new fellow, but long professor at the University of Hong Kong. I was just, given that the conference is, looking at U.S.-China relations, and we are looking across the Americas here, just wondering how the panelists would compare that with South and Southeast Asia. As, I'm kind of thinking when I was listening here, there's almost a benign quality to China's presence in the Americas. Even though it's the U.S. backyard, it doesn't seem to be viewed as a huge security threat, more of a kind of a trade and aid issue. But in Southeast Asia and South Asia, I would think the U.S.'s concerns, and of course the pushback in the region is much more dramatic. With China's, we saw in Malaysia the most recent case of disavowing projects with China and so on, but it's going on across the region. But the U.S. also has a long security presence in that part of the world and tends to align to contain China in various ways, in that region in ways that I haven't heard in the discussions of the U.S. backyard here. So I'm just wondering how the panelists might compare this picture. It's kind of what's missing from the discussion here is the South and Southeast Asia part of U.S.-China relations. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Mike, for that question. I mean, to the extent that it's missing here is, of course, yeah, because it's the Western Hemisphere, and it is very, very different. I feel relieved I slipped maybe over 10 years ago into this whole China-Latin America issue because I was living in Colombia and got more and more interested, and it is the furthest away region physically from China, so it's in that sense quite understandable that China was has been a latecomer there. There are obviously stories about the Manila galleon trade hundreds of years ago, 400 years ago, that linked them tenuously, but the distance is quite real. And that's also something that maybe ought to play into more confidence, because even if the US, Americans see themselves as exceptional and can behave in any way they like, one should also understand that they should also understand that there is a very real closeness, not the Monroe Doctrine sort of closeness, but I was speaking to a Venezuelan individual who lives here now, and he was saying, well, even if, and Brazilians actually say the same, even though there are difficulties engaging on certain themes with the United States, seeing eye to eye on certain things, even Venezuelan, even Chavistas will send their children for holidays to Florida if they can, and will send their kids to study here, and so there is still a very strong cultural linkage that I think one can't deny, that won't go away however many Confucius Institutes you open up in South America. So I think that's why it's difficult to compare these. I mean, the Southeast Asian, the dynamic is completely different and has much longer roots, and the Latin America one is sort of kind of a clean slate until about 2000 and is growing from there. But it's a very different dynamic.
I can speak to Canada, not with much of anything on Southeast Asia, but on in America's backyard. One of the questions I would get a lot from Canadians when they're discussing prospective closer relations with China is, well, what do you think the Americans will think? Will there be backlash? Will there be retaliation? And with the Americans that I speak to, particularly those who are decision makers, legislators, is to the extent they think of us at all, they don't think much. It's like, well, good luck with that, but we know China's very, very hard to trade with, and if you think you can make any headway, off you go. But so in the absence of that much U.S. interest that I have seen, and also in the absence of Canada having a policy, the fact that it has been, swayed towards some, emotional responses that don't really make a lot of sense. They're actually focusing more on sort of a case-by-case evaluation, and it has swung wildly on things like foreign investment. Sometimes they're too open, in my opinion, and sometimes they're too punitive. It really has to do with what the political feeling is at the time. There was a recent potential Chinese investment in a large Canadian construction company, and it was turned down by the government of Canada under a similar process as your CFIUS here. And it was, well, if we let the Chinese state-owned enterprise run this big Canadian construction company, then they'll have access to our infrastructure secrets, and it will facilitate spying. Oh, really? Okay. But for the most part, in the absence of a strong policy of thou shalt or thou shalt not, we've been going on a case-by-case basis, remembering that Chinese activity and behavior in Canada is governed by Canadian laws, and so it is only as good or bad as Canada's ability to monitor what is actually happening.
Can I take a slightly different take in the answer to this? When I think about Southeast Asia and Latin America in terms of like environmental and energy type engagement, clearly, China has been investing in hydropower and resource extraction from its closer neighbors a lot longer. And so I do see a lot more, like, keeping in mind, like, U.S. foundations and NGOs engaging, like, along the Mekong issues of, it's not just, there's the anti-dam stuff, but we're starting to see more attempts at dialogue building. And even the State Department, and I don't know if they're still as involved, but in Yunnan and Southeast Asia, trying to get conversations going about, well, rationalizing the hydropower. What what if Chinese hydropower, and even the Yunnan government saying that, well, if we sell our electricity to Southeast Asian countries, they don't have to build as many dams. So there's a lot of environmental and clean energy conversations, projects, activities going on in Southeast Asia, with U.S. groups. I think it's starting to get a little bit more in Latin America. And even what I like too, another kind of sign for it, there's a NGO called China Dialogue. It's actually an online blog. It started it's by a Guardian journalist and opened his office in Beijing. It's really the only bilingual environmental journal online that you have. And looking at climate change, well, they have an office in Peru now. And I think that's, and you're starting to see like Boston College, that they've got this whole big research team looking at China's extractive resources in Latin America. So again, I'm starting to see a shift expanding, looking at Latin America. So just wanted to toss that in.
I'll just add a brief comment of my own, because your question about Southeast Asia touched on the point that I made in my opening remarks. All countries are sensitive to activities that have potential security implications that occur in their vicinity. But great powers are in a position to do something about it, so that their reactions are more significant in a way. But every region is different, geographically and in terms of the historical involvement of other countries in their vicinities. The United States has been fortunate that there weren't big power involvements in the Western Hemisphere for quite a bit of the time. And our Monroe Doctrine emerged because we were sensitive about efforts by the big powers of Europe at the time to try to reestablish footholds in the Western Hemisphere. But big powers have been involved in East Asia for centuries. And there's a different pattern of relationships there. The United States has two of our most important defense arrangements in Northeast Asia, and we still have the remnants of the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization in the south, which affects our security relations with Thailand and the Philippines. We have a bilateral security agreement. In Europe, of course, we have the U.S. involvement through NATO. China doesn't have anything now comparable to that. But what I was trying to tease out from raising the issue is it is important to understanding the dynamics of the relationship between the United States and China to see how China reacts to activities by the United States in its vicinity and how we react to Chinese activities, whether in the economic, in this case it involved a political issue. So far the Chinese have not really been involved militarily in the Western Hemisphere, but when the Soviet Union was involved through arms sales on a very limited basis, and in the case of Cuba, the United States reaction was very strong. So these types of questions are very important in terms of understanding the behavior patterns of big powers, especially when power relationships are in the process of change. In the back there?
Kent Watkins, Chairman, American Academy of Housing and Communities. I wonder if the panel could address the next level of governance, or at least the third level maybe, of cities in China interacting with cities in the US and elsewhere in Canada and so forth, and what's going on there in the areas of cooperation and perhaps non-cooperation in energy and city building, land use, and other technologies. Thank you.
I think that's mine.
Jennifer?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that when I gave you my quick skim of U.S.-China energy and environmental cooperation, that at times as the high level cooperation wanes, what we've been seeing in the last decade in particular, a lot of U.S. cities and states are starting to, they're looking to cooperate with China on climate issues. California taking the lead, of course. It was Arnold Schwarzenegger first signed. I signed an MOU with China on climate. All right, so he did that. So it's so California's foreign policy with China has been quite aggressive on promoting cooperation. And in fact, right after the U.S.-China climate agreement was signed, Los Angeles hosted the U.S.-China Climate Leaders Summit that brought together something like 30 Chinese cities and provinces with similar number in the U.S. And talked a lot about climate issues and started brokering kind of agreements and committing to targets and hopefully, having cooperation on this. And you see California companies trying to be quite aggressive in cooperating in China. Natural Resources Defense Council brokered talking of romance, we have a romance between Jiangsu province and California on energy efficiency. And that kind of experiment helped feed into a demand-side management policy that was passed in China. So, yeah, there's definitely a lot of romance between U.S. and Chinese cities, and talking on climate and energy issues. So it's in fact just next week I'm having a meeting. Oh, this is such on about urban cooperation around waste. We're having a meeting on sludge and waste and methane capture. I'm bringing a Chinese group to the U.S. to look at L.A. and D.C. in terms of I'm going to get to tour wastewater treatment plants next week. It's very exciting. So yeah, and so there's a lot of interest in China on like how are we successful on cleaning up our environments. And
yeah, I would agree. In Canada, it's very much on the romance side of the ledger. Despite that, large number of Canadians that are suspicious of relations with China, I think every Canadian mayor has been to China on some sort of mayor's sister city or province state junket. And similarly, Canada has had a really hard time getting its oil out to Tidewater. But in the oil sector, in the energy sector, and in the renewable sector, it's got all sorts of skills and abilities. So it's looking at ways to export energy services and renewable services to China, and has been very, very active on that front.
It happens about 2 years ago, I was working for the Bogota Mayor's Office in the International Department, and that was quite fascinating to see how, on a cultural level also, for example, Guangzhou was reaching out to Bogota. In fact, they visited 3 times in only the space of 8 months or so, and were giving prizes this way and that. And so there's a very active municipal diplomacy going on from China. The interesting thing is quite different maybe from the US, which has been, so federalized and has these each state sort of has its own engagements. The many Latin American cities and governments seem to find it confusing that only Shandong is reaching out to, say, a part of Colombia, or only one. The China is still. It's easier and preferable to see China as a monolith, but therefore you don't get through. And in fact, many of the Chinese sub-national government units are developing their own strategies for different areas of the world, and including of Latin America. So, but it's difficult to find those points of engagement. But there's a lot happening there, and it's very interesting to watch.
Mm-hmm. In the back there.
Very briefly, I'm Madeline Ross from
yes, thank you.
Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. This is a question for Benjamin Kreutzfeld. I just wondered if you could say anything more about the fact that China has recently sent an MOU to the countries of Latin America proposing that they become members of the BRI, as we're all trying to understand what this concept really is, whether you know anything about, what they're proposing in terms of those MOUs.
Thank you, Madeline. Unfortunately, I haven't seen one of those MOUs, but I ought to ask because the person who told me has seen it. So I just know that they've sent them all around, and that even the Panamanian government signed 19 MOUs on all sorts of things when it established relations with Beijing a year ago, but the actual contents of those I have not seen, so I couldn't tell you exactly. It is, being an MOU, there have been many that sort of just stay there in sort of floating around and don't actually lead to anything. We have to recognize that there was an MOU to study a free trade agreement between Colombia and China did do some studies, but Colombia hasn't 5 years on, or 6 years on. So they may just stay there, and I think it is obviously sort of symbolic, but I also picture all of this has a human dimension, and so there is someone in the Chinese Foreign Ministry with a map of the world and wants to put a flag on every capital that signs the MOU, but some have, and I think that's something that once that is established, and there have been meetings on academic and subnational government levels in China a lot. that pave the way and that may make it possible to work on some things. What China has learned is to have that's the new foreign policy. The name for Chinese foreign policy may be now BRI, and that simply everything is packaged within that. And then companies have learned not to necessarily bid independently for infrastructure projects, but to go into joint ventures with local companies, and there they have been more successful, and that then can be probably financed more easily from China, or at least supported more easily within the BRI framework. That's maybe the idea.
There was another question back there. Yeah.
Yeah, Ken Meyercord, TV producer. Nicaragua maintained relations with Taiwan for a long time. I don't know whether they've switched or not, but whether they have or not, what is the likely effect of the fact that Chinese interests, and I use that word instead of Chinese government purposely, is working with the Nicaraguans on a canal across Nicaragua?
Wow. That one is yours, Benjamin.
I thought the Nicaraguan canal was now dead
It's
because
dead.
they, I think so.
It was
no
there was
longer
huge
is.
environmental outcry against it too. Yeah.
As well, there are many reasons to have an outcry against it. But no, they haven't established relations. In fact, there was a congressional confirmation hearing for new ambassadors, U.S. ambassadors to Nicaragua and Honduras just 2 weeks ago, and they were specifically quizzed. Will you make it clear to the government, should you be selected, that we will not have, we will not tolerate, we will not be happy. I don't know how exactly how Marco Rubio said it exactly, but that we would not condone establishing relations with Beijing. So that was a key moment. But Nicaragua, that's still on the table, I suppose. But I think China, having now greater ease of access to the Panama Canal, which exists, and is something that takes away, takes all the wind out of the sails for the Nicaragua project, which anyway was officially never supported by any by the Beijing government in any way. I think so. It's kind of off the table.
We have time for one more question, as long as it's a short one.
Hi, I'm Noah Neo from the Singapore Embassy. I just had a question on, beyond being seen as sort of a market or a trading partner or a source of investment, to what extent is China seen as a model of development for Latin American and Caribbean countries, in terms of the sort of the state-run system that's helped China to become quite a prosperous economy that it is today?
Gosh, the China model question. I mean, that is very difficult. And again, something similarly often much used term was bandied about the rules-based system, implying that China doesn't have rules or doesn't enforce rules. It's also a tricky one, because I mean there is certainly something like a China model, but the Chinese certainly don't try to promote it. There is, of course, all sorts of 中国特色 things, like the China special characteristics foreign policy, great country foreign policy, and many, many other elements. I mean, that's something that Washington tends to be worried about, and that China is undermining what are anyway, for instance, fragile democracies in Latin America. But I really think that although individuals, for example, there were quotes that the FMLN left-wing party in El Salvador that established relations with Beijing was impressed, like they were very impressed with Deng Xiaoping's opening up policy, and that's something that they felt, wow, if only we could have do something similar. But neither certainly China doesn't pressure, and nor do any of the countries that I have any illusions that this could be copied. However, there are individual elements, like I mentioned earlier. The Great Western Development push by China is something that is sort of a model for BRI. You can find all sorts of economic studies that better connectivity leads to better economic growth, and that's, after all, what you think many countries want. And so there's and another thing is China is pretty successful, maybe controversially so, in suppressing and reducing corruption. Countries in Central and Latin South America are not so successful. So, though I don't think anybody would support executing corrupt officials, there are still quite a few sort of useful patterns that China has that might be at least inspiring for different groups in Latin America.
I've got a quick response to that. Not much about Nicaragua, but about the rules-based system, in that one thing China has been very successful in doing is turning over the received wisdom about the liberal post-war order, which was essentially created in the image of U.S. interests and U.S. commercial policy. Now Canada picked that up and we said, okay, we would rather have closer alignments and lower transaction costs than policy sovereignty. So we bought in early and continued to do that. China has proven that the way things are or were is not necessarily the way things always have to be. So with the U.S. withdrawing from the rules leadership in the world, in the international trading system anyway, it does create the vacuum that is open for any contender to fill.
And I have to jump in for, looking at China, because I look at the environmental lens. China, not necessarily a poster child for how you really want to protect the environment. That said, now last few years on a war on pollution, shifting the Titanic coal direction, but in some ways they can do that because I call it environmental authoritarianism. That they can, but that sometimes it goes off the track. That you can, even the wind power, they have all this. State-owned enterprises were told, we'll give you subsidies if you go into clean energy, and suddenly we had all these solar farms and wind farms in the middle of nowhere, not connected to a grid, garbage renewables. And so just kind of tossing out there that in some ways how China's developed up until now, not the best model for environment, but there are some interesting changes in terms of how rapidly with the war on pollution, but some of that too where it's getting a bit sticky in China is trying to really continue opening up on open information, the governance issues, public participation, and but those are the bits that need to work for it to move to really green. So
I'd like to thank all of our panelists. I think we've seen a very interesting understanding emerge from the discussion, which is the Western Hemisphere illustrates the economic dimension of the U.S. rivalry with China on a global basis. When the Soviet Union tried to move into the Western Hemisphere, it was with the purpose of being able to find bases for missiles that would alter the strategic balance in a war situation between the United States and the Soviet Union. That aspect is absent from the Chinese activities in the Western Hemisphere at the present time, but the Soviet Union never represented any economic factor in the Western Hemisphere. What they offered was military power and some security responses to countries here in the Western Hemisphere that felt threatened by the United States. So it's a very different type of rivalry, and it's important to understand this economic dimension because China globally now is offering an economic alternative to countries and is deeply interested in gaining better access to their resources because of China's own rapid growth rate. So thank our panelists for helping to educate us.